I need to tell you about a conversation that took place inside the Cleveland Browns facility, one that most people on the outside have no idea happened, and one that I genuinely believe changed the trajectory of this franchise. Not a press conference, not a front office announcement, a direct, unambiguous, no-exit confrontation between Myles Garrett and the veterans who had been quietly working to undermine Shedeur Sanders since the moment he walked through the door. When I say Garrett drew a line, I don't mean it metaphorically. I mean he found the people responsible, stood in front of them, and told them in terms that left absolutely no interpretive wiggle room that what they were doing was over. Understanding why that moment carries the weight it does requires understanding exactly who Myles Garrett is inside that building. And that's where I want to start. The word leader gets used so indiscriminately in NFL coverage that it's been almost completely emptied of meaning. But Garrett's standing in Cleveland isn't a media construction or a marketing position. It was built across years of demonstrated choice under genuinely difficult circumstances. Think about what he's actually lived through in that organization, losing seasons that accumulated into a pattern, coaching staff overhauls that reset everything from scheme to culture, a quarterback situation that cycled through so many iterations of hope and disappointment that it stopped feeling like a problem being solved and started feeling like a permanent organizational condition. Through every version of that cycle, Garrett's competitive output never reflected the environment around him. He didn't find excuses in losing records. He didn't treat poor team circumstances as permission to dial down his own standards. He was dominant every week regardless of what the standings said, regardless of what was happening in the quarterback room, regardless of whether the team around him gave anyone rational cause for optimism. That consistency, chosen consistently over years when the easier path was always available, is what produces the kind of credibility that can't be assigned from outside. It has to be earned from within. And at every moment when Garrett's production and profile gave him genuine leverage to force his way to a franchise with a better immediate outlook, he stayed. He chose Cleveland, repeatedly, because underneath everything is a real belief that this organization can become something worth the investment of his best years. That belief, and what it cost him to maintain it, is the foundation for everything he did on Shedeur's behalf. So when he saw what was happening inside that locker room, when the shape of the resistance against Shedeur became fully clear to him, the response wasn't a carefully considered organizational calculation. It was a man who has waited too long for a genuine chance to see it poisoned by people who couldn't get past their own ego deciding he was done waiting for someone else to handle it. Here's what the resistance actually looked like, and I think the specific nature of it matters enormously for understanding why it was so corrosive and why conventional management channels couldn't reach it. This wasn't open conflict. Nobody was shouting at Shedeur in team meetings or refusing to engage with him on the practice field in ways that coaches could observe and address. What was happening was far more calculated and, because of that calculation, far more damaging. Certain veterans had constructed an atmosphere of deliberate indifference, a cultivated professional coldness that communicated at every turn that this kid hadn't been accepted and wasn't going to be. Comments phrased with just enough ambiguity that nobody could be directly confronted about them. Body language in group settings that broadcast dismissal without ever crossing into anything formally reportable. The kind of environmental hostility that an experienced professional knows how to maintain precisely because it operates below the threshold of accountability. Try to place yourself in Shedeur's position inside that environment. You have organizational backing. The coaching staff's rep distribution is pointing towards you. The evaluation process is moving in your direction. And yet the actual texture of every day inside that facility carries a message that contradicts all of it. A persistent signal from certain veteran voices that you are an outsider in a room that was here before you and will decide for itself whether you belong. That kind of atmosphere doesn't just make a young quarterback uncomfortable. It actively degrades the developmental environment he needs, because development at that level requires the investment and collaboration of the people around you, and both were being withheld with apparent deliberateness. And then the situation escalated past ambient coldness into something that had direct organizational consequences. Garrett learned that these same veterans had been taking their resistance to the coaching staff, using polished, reasonable-sounding language about competitive processes and the value of keeping evaluations open, effectively lobbying for Shedeur's path to the starting role to be deliberately complicated. I want to be very clear about what that actually represents, because the professional vocabulary wrapped around it makes it sound more legitimate than it is. That is, veteran players using their institutional standing to actively work against a specific player's advancement, not because of genuine football evaluation, not because of honest competitive concerns, but because their personal comfort with the existing dynamic mattered more to them than what was actually best for the team. When that became clear to Garrett, Whatever patience he had been extending to the situation closed off entirely. His response was nothing like the indirect, deniable tactics that had been used against Shedeur. No quiet counter-lobbying, no carefully worded conversations that created pressure while preserving plausible deniability. He went directly to the people involved, and the message he delivered was simple enough that nobody could walk away from it claiming they didn't understand. This is finished. Shedeur Sanders has earned his opportunity in this building. He deserves the full support of this locker room rather than its organized resistance. And anyone whose ego or insecurity is going to keep driving them to work against that needs to know exactly what they've declared themselves to be and who now sees them clearly. That's the substance of it. Delivered by Myles Garrett. Personally, without diplomatic cushioning. I keep coming back to the specific weight that Garrett's identity as the messenger adds to that moment because I think it's genuinely the most important variable in the whole dynamic. The same message from a coordinator lands as organizational management. Veterans hear it, make the necessary external adjustments, and continue their internal resistance unchanged. From a front office representative, it registers as institutional noise, the kind of cultural values communication that professional athletes have developed highly effective filters for. But from Garrett? It doesn't get filed anywhere. It doesn't get processed through filters. It lands in the part of a professional psychology where real calculations get made because the implicit consequence of not accepting it is placing yourself in visible opposition to the person who's standing in that building is higher than anyone else's. Nobody in that locker room was prepared to make that choice publicly. The math resolves very quickly when the social cost of continuing becomes that specific. What I find myself genuinely struck by, separate from everything Garrett did, is the picture of Shedeur that emerged from how he handled all of this from his own end. Nothing leaked, no signals on social media, no carefully placed, anonymously sourced complaints painting him as a wronged party, no cryptic public statements that people could read between the lines of. He was in the facility every day doing the work, and the internal pressure of navigating a hostile locker room environment produced zero external outputs visible to the outside world. That level of compartmentalization is not a default setting. It's a developed capacity, and I think its origin is fairly clear when you consider what the Colorado years actually put him through. 2 seasons at Boulder under the full weight of a scrutiny that no college quarterback faces at that sustained intensity. Every performance filtered through the question of whether his father's system was manufacturing his numbers, whether the last name explained the production, whether the attention surrounding him reflected genuine talent or something else. That is a specific and relentless kind of external noise, and living inside it for 2 years forces a choice. You either develop the genuine ability to separate your internal process from the external conversation, or it breaks your focus. Shedeur came through it with the separation intact, and the fact that the same capacity held up inside a professional facility dealing with organized veteran resistance confirms that what Colorado forged in him wasn't situational. It's structural. It's real. That said, I want to make a distinction here that I think matters. Enduring difficult circumstances through personal resilience is meaningful. Having the most important player in your organization decide that your success is worth his personal intervention, that operates on a completely different register. What Garrett did wasn't simply protect Shedeur from an uncomfortable situation. He changed the architectural reality of how that locker room functions in relation to its quarterback. And the mechanism of how that change worked is worth slowing down on. Before Garrett acted, the veterans opposing Shedeur were in a position of zero social consequence. They could maintain their coldness, pursue their lobbying, and face no meaningful pushback from anyone with real standing in the building. The behavior was essentially free. Garrett's intervention made it immediately costly. Once his personal investment in Shedeur's success became explicit, not as a formal organizational position but as Myles Garrett's actual personal stated conviction, continuing to oppose Shedeur became a statement about something much larger than your feelings toward a rookie quarterback. It became a statement about your relationship with Garrett himself. Nobody was willing to make that statement. The cold shoulders didn't fade gradually. They found warmth with the specific efficiency that locker room social dynamics produce when the cost-benefit calculation shifts suddenly and completely. The football evidence that underlies all of this deserves direct acknowledgement because Garrett's investment isn't blind loyalty. It's grounded in what the tape actually shows. 7 starts under conditions that would have made any young quarterback's numbers look bad. A team that had stopped competing by the time Shedeur was deployed, protection that couldn't sustain clean pockets, skill position talent that ranged from adequate to genuinely limiting. 1,400 passing yards, 7 touchdowns, a Pro Bowl selection that made him the first Cleveland quarterback to earn that recognition in close to 20 years. The interceptions were real, 10 of them, and I've never tried to explain them away. But the context they need to be read inside is the context of a player inserted into live professional football without preseason preparation, without first-team reps, without the foundational infrastructure that quarterback development actually requires. Those turnovers are the product of an impossible situation, not a window into his ceiling. Garrett watches the pocket management, not the scrambling instinct that young quarterbacks lean on when pressure arrives and processing slows, but the actual spatial manipulation, the subtle movement that reshapes throwing lanes and generates new angles that weren't there a half second ago. And he recognizes it as a quality that players don't typically develop this early. He watches the anticipation throws, the ones where the release point has to precede the completion of the route, where you're committing to a location based on projection rather than confirmation, and he sees the processing speed that separates the quarterbacks who will grow into franchise players from the ones who won't. He has watched enough quarterbacks cycle through Cleveland to know the difference between the ones who have something real and the ones who are performing adequately. His read on Shedeur falls into a third category entirely, the ones you build around. Some people will argue Garrett overstepped, that the defensive side of the roster doesn't have jurisdiction over quarterback room dynamics. That proper organizational structure means position groups stay in their lanes and leadership flows through official channels. I understand the argument. But the locker room transformations that have actually changed franchise trajectories in NFL history weren't produced by people who waited for formal authorization before acting on what they could see. They were produced by individuals who looked at a situation, made a judgment about what waiting would cost, and used the credibility they had earned to address it directly. Garrett made that judgment. Looking at his history in Cleveland, at what he has given and what he has chosen to stay through, I cannot identify a version of events where that judgment was wrong. The veterans who built their resistance now sit in a position of limited and uncomfortable options. They were addressed in the private spaces where culture actually forms. Not publicly, not in ways that give them grievances to nurse or narratives to construct, and they know with complete clarity where Garrett stands, where the coaching staff is committed, and where the organizational evaluation has settled. The choice available to them is not complicated once you strip the emotion from it. Align with the direction this team is moving, or continue opposing it with Garrett's full personal weight now actively working against you. Most will choose alignment. For the ones who don't, the organization has its own mechanisms for resolving that. What I see when I put all of it together is a franchise that has achieved a level of genuine internal alignment around its quarterback that Cleveland hasn't had at that position in a very long time. The coaching commitment is real. The performance evidence from last season is documented. The independent professional evaluation has validated what the internal voices have been saying. And now the most respected player in the building has made Shedeur's success explicitly personal in a way that restructured the social reality of the locker room around him. When Shedeur Sanders takes that first snap as the undisputed starting quarterback of the Cleveland Browns, the people watching will see a quarterback and a team. They will not see the internal architecture that made the moment possible. They won't see the resistance that had to be dismantled or the confrontations that did the dismantling or the years of earned credibility that gave those confrontations their weight. That infrastructure will be invisible, but it will be the ground the whole thing was built on, and the man who poured it has been waiting his entire Cleveland career for a foundation worth building something on.